Hello and welcome to this script webinar in association with ICON. My name is Jo Shorthouse. I'm the features editor on Script and have covered all aspects of the pharmaceutical industry for the last 8 years. My guest for this webinar is Clara Hearing, the Senior Vice President of Clinical Risk and Data Management for ICON. Clara has over 20 years' experience in clinical research, which spans both the CRO and pharma industries. Today, we're going to discuss the looming and significant changes to the ICH GCP Guidelines. These guidelines not only harmonise the conduct of clinical trials in light of the various regulatory reforms by ICH member states, but they also establish novel, forward-thinking principles. These changes have broad implications for those working within the clinical research industry, and it is important that they're ready to adapt to the changes and embrace a shift in processes and behaviours. Sponsors really need to be aware of what is required of them in this new risk management framework, and Clara is here today to answer all my questions about the biggest impacts and how, in practice, the industry can ready itself. So, Clara, if you were to be asked what is the single biggest change that these new guidelines are going to bring, what would that be?
Well, actually, Jo, there's three main topics of change.
Okay.
The first one is around technology. The second one is around a risk-based approach to quality and monitoring, and the third one is around oversight.
Okay, so if we could just go firstly into technology, what are the really big changes that's going to come into that arena?
So I think we have a lot of opportunity with the new technologies that aggregate data to look at trends earlier. And therefore, we need to make sure that the people who look at those type of aggregated data are trained properly in how to use that data and make decisions on the right things. So we do not want to have early decisions that might influence the outcome of the study in a negative way, but we want to safeguard human subject protection and data reliability through these new tools. Another part around technology is it changes. It changes all the time.
Yes.
There are new inventions, new ways in which we can use data to progress. And what regulators want us to do is to make sure that in 20 years' time, when we look at whatever is the data technology at that moment, we can still recreate the environment that was active today, so we can validate, they can validate, and we can validate the data and the data structures that were built today, and validate the assumptions and decisions that were made based on the data that is made available today. So how do we validate the technology? How do we maintain it as we change from version to version or innovate around technology?
Okay.
And the last thing is we want to make sure that if we take a document and put it into a technology system, that doesn't lose any of the essential features of that document. So have some way in which we certify documents and copies of documents.
Okay. So what about the risk-based quality and monitoring side of things? I mean, this must be, I would think that would be a really, really huge
That is a huge change indeed. And it's actually due to the way that we've evolved in our hospitals and how we treat patients as well as how we think about protocols. So if you think about how hospitals have evolved, it used to be that we had a single investigator and study nurse who would do all the trial activities.
Yes.
That's no longer the case. We have a lot of people and also a lot of devices and technologies that are changing in hospitals. So we need to adapt our monitoring practice to this variability and still get reliable data.
Okay.
And what do we do there? So we have to think about what do we really need to verify when we are on site? How do we verify that the device that is being used is delivering the data with the right kind of accuracy as it's set out in the protocol? And how can we use the new technologies to see in a central way, in an aggregated way, if there are trends that are indicative of issues in different hospitals, in different sites around data quality? So really take a much more proactive approach in thinking ahead of time about this type of variability and focus our activities on what is critical data and processes for the trial at hand in human subject protection and study data reliability.
So these all seem to be quite practical things that we need to be thinking about, the practical use of technology, the centralisation of data and using that data and verifying it. So what about, you mentioned oversight as well, that seems to be a very important part for the sponsor to be thinking about, I'm assuming, because the oversight of the CRO and the study sites.
Yes, indeed. The regulators have also included now in ICH a much more descriptive sentence around what sponsors need to do in order to verify that the CROs are delivering quality and that they are being overseen by the sponsors. So there is a real recognition that sponsors need to oversee the CROs and how they work. But also sites, investigators and institutions also deploy certain services, delegate tasks, and they also need to maintain oversight over those tasks. And that's now mandated by ICH GCP. It was always in the spirit, but it's now clearly documented there.
So there's a very practical description of, or a principle of this is what we really need you to be doing.
Exactly. ICH is really about principles.
Yes.
It's about saying what the outcome needs to be, and how you get there is what we all are striving to get as efficiently as possible.
So if we could just carry on this theme of how things are going to change in very much in practical terms, I'm interested in the way that the changes to these guidelines are going to impact the way that clinical trials are actually conducted in physical terms, really. So what's going to be the impact on sponsors specifically?
So I think there are things that will change in how sponsors and CROs interact with each other.
Okay.
There is a lot more focus on starting the monitoring activities with a risk assessment. And the sponsor needs to bring to that risk assessment their prior knowledge around what has happened in the prior trials or even preclinical data around that particular investigational product that they're developing, so that we can jointly think about what could go wrong, where the risks are in that particular trial. And so the sponsors and the CROs need to work much more together in focusing on what matters and building a monitoring plan that addresses that.
So that the interaction between them has got to be much closer, so, and also from a much earlier starting point, I would think.
Indeed. And then the sponsors need to be enabled to manage the risks, or be clear about which risk management pieces they want to delegate to the sponsor, which decisions they want to retain, and which decisions they're happy to have the CROs take in terms of level of risk at patient level, at operations level, and all the different aspects of the trial conduct. So really sponsors need to think ahead of time, what is it that they want to delegate and want to keep in terms of risk management.
Okay. And what about the impact on sites and investigators? Are they also going to have to be involved in much more in the planning stages, or is that going to be impacted at all? Or?
Right. So what happens in practice is that the new monitoring strategy deployed by CROs or sponsors has a different impact on sites. Before we would go, the CRA would go to the site on a very regular schedule, let's say every 6 to 8 weeks, and they would manage the quality in that way.
Yes.
Now, with a mix of on-site and central monitoring, not only will the CRAs do more by telephone, they will go to sites maybe less frequently, but how they conduct their investigations and monitoring activities might be slightly different to what sites have been used to. They will be going much more into detail around how things are done and verify the procedures and ask questions around which devices, calibrations in much more detail perhaps than before, and more regularly than before, because we are really trying to get at that consistent way at which we gather data from all sites.
Okay. And I guess we've also got to think about kind of the end user almost in this situation, the patient. Is it going to affect them in any way? Are they looking at more paperwork perhaps, or different ways of recording data? Is that going to have an impact on their kind of daily lives, as it were, in a clinical trial?
So, as such, the ICH GCP guidelines really help us to think more and more about what matters to patients. So, what is the critical data for human subject protection, their integrity, do they give the right consents, and focus on the data and processes at site to support patient safety and make sure that we get the best type of data for assessing efficacy. Perhaps previously the spirit was more, what do investigators and doctors think would work for patients? Today we're much more focused in all our activities on what matters to the end user, the patient.
Yes.
And there is a lot of innovation around that, and we are trying and pulling the patient into decision making earlier, more in how protocols are written and what kind of data we gather. So patients will, over time, be involved more and more and more in the framework of decision making around clinical trials.
And as you say, it's a lot of this kind of activities going on in the industry. Patient centricity is a huge buzz phrase from the last couple of years. So it's nice to see that it's also reflected in guidelines as well when it comes to actually interacting with the patient in the way that they experience the clinical study as well.
Right. So the guidance is really focusing on critical data for human subject protection and study data reliability, which in the end is going to focus more and more on what matters to patients.
So when these guidelines do eventually come into force, what practical steps should be taken by sponsors and by CROs?
So I think sponsors perhaps need to consider how they are maintaining systematic oversight of tasks they conduct themselves and delegate to CROs and sponsors in this new environment where we are focusing more on critical data and processes. What is it that they need to see, own, take decisions on in terms of human subject protection, in terms of investigational product, vendor reliability, topics that matter in the conduct of the clinical trial and development of the asset to a particular aim. There are roles that are existing in the sponsor which might have been focused on delivering tasks which now evolve into more critical thinking, into more decision making. And so what is it that they need to support there in order to help evolve and manage those changes? In terms of how CROs help sponsors in that space, is what can we as CROs do to support sponsors in having the right kind of data, the right kind of transparency of how we operate, and maintain effective oversight without necessarily having to duplicate everything.
Yes.
So what is it that you can rely on? What is it that gives that level of comfort that you have control without micromanagement or redoing things, but really focusing on what matters? So technologies help, skills help, processes help, and so what is it that we all need to do in terms of our own skills to support this new environment?
It sounds like perhaps there might be a different aspect of the partnership between CROs and sponsors moving forward as well, perhaps much more guidance from the CROs and just a shift perhaps in the way that those two elements come together to create a clinical study.
It can, yes. So I think the sponsors are all in different places.
Yes.
So there are sponsors who are very evolved in their own space around adopting the new ICH guidance. There are others that are perhaps very small or have very few resources to enable that, and who are more reliant on CROs to support them in this change. So there is a variation, but every sponsor needs to think, what is it that they feel is critical for them in terms of oversight, and how will they get what they need there, and CROs are there to help.
So what steps should be taken to address readiness in this new paradigm that we're seeing about to begin?
Yeah, so I think it's if you look at how the ICH GCP was introduced in the draft document, they're focusing on technologies and risk management sciences to enable us to evolve to this new paradigm. So what do you as a company have in terms of technology, people and processes that enable you to do that? What is it that you are learning about those risk sciences? There is a huge wealth of information coming from other industries which have focused on risk management sciences perhaps before we did,
right,
as an industry. So invest in keeping up to date on what is available from aviation, nuclear industry, health and safety are even sometimes ahead of us in a lot of aspects. So what is it that we need to learn in terms of approaches to guiding people, guiding technology, and in the end, of course, having the processes that drive us here.
So it sounds like this might be quite a good time for introspection, for companies to almost reassess themselves and look at their processes, as you say, learn from other industries like aviation, etc., and really be quite critical about themselves, I'm assuming, and look at it, what can we do better, and where are our strengths?
Yes, I think that's a good perspective. Having said that, I think we have done an amazing job already in supporting development of new investigational products that help patients worldwide. I think there is an opportunity to evolve that to an even better space. And so I think this is about being excited about what we can learn, rather than to be critical about what we did in the past.
Okay.
I think, and I really believe that's the excitement buzz, even though I know most people don't like change. This is the exciting bit about it.
If we take out the word change and replace it with innovation, perhaps that's...
It helps.
Yes.
It helps.
That's more of a buzz.
Indeed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with these new guidelines coming into place, do you think, in your opinion, that we should stop 100% SDV?
Actually, I think we should. I believe that we have defined SDV in recent years as the verification of copying transcription of what is in the patient's medical record to the CRF.
Okay.
I think the errors that people make in this copying or transcription of data are very few.
Yes.
And if there are errors, they do not really matter.
Okay.
So what is much more important to do is to verify if procedures, as they are dictated by a protocol, are followed with consistency by different sites.
Okay.
That process is called source data review or source document review, depending on, I guess, the institution or person you're speaking to. And that process is really adding value to ensure that we have scientifically accurate data where it matters.
Okay.
And so, do people have to use the same device, or can they use different devices? Do they use the same process at site to get data from a patient? And where is the variability in that, and do we accept that variability? So that's where I think we're moving away from 100% SDV to verifying consistency in how things are done at site in order to get the data for the protocol.
So it's still, again, it's going back to this consistency piece, which you've mentioned earlier on as well. It's so important to have the right data processes at different sites that can be consistent across the board.
Exactly. So I could ask you, what is your weight? And you would give me an answer. Exactly. Or I can measure it, and I can measure it with more or less accuracy. And that is where a protocol needs to guide. What is it that is relevant for this protocol in terms of critical data?
Okay. So I always think of the role of the CRO is to be the expert advisor on clinical trials and designing and creating studies, but also working with sponsors and clients to create flexible solutions that obviously rigorously test compounds to their absolute limit and safety and efficacy. So I was just wondering how you keep within guidelines and regulations that still create these flexible solutions for clients. How do those two things, are they mutually exclusive, or can they be married together in some way?
So fortunately, they can be married together in some way. Indeed. I think the beauty of the GCP is its principles. It's not fixed standards with a limited practical application. These standards, principles that we are working towards are actually outcomes that we're looking to achieve. So take an example of blood pressure measurement. You can decide as a sponsor, I want to be very rigid, I want to have one single standard, and so every site that is participating in my trial will get exactly the same device.
Okay.
And the only thing we need to verify is people, do they know how to use the device and are they using it consistently? That device will now measure when the data is being captured, how it is captured, etc. Or you can decide, I actually allow any device to be used at site, and I just want to make sure that the processes that the sites deploy in order to measure the blood pressure is consistent. They do it twice, once with the patient standing, once with the patient sitting, and we reduce variability in that way. And then you can add central monitoring on top of that,
Okay.
and see, okay, what is the trend of data coming from site Dr. Jones, and you'd see a nice Gauss curve, and you look at another site and it's all the same values. Well, there's obviously something not going quite well at the other site. So really, the flexibility is we want blood pressure measurement with a level of accuracy, scientific accuracy, or just enough to know if the patient's okay. So there's different choices to be made there. And the ultimate outcome is we want data to be used by the regulators and ourselves, of course, to see whether the drug is efficacious and safe. And there's a lot of variability in how we achieve that, and choices we can make in what data is critical and how critical it is.
So these guidelines aren't going to impede the role of the CRO to create these flexible solutions and be able to lead the way in designing trials, basically.
Exactly. So really, there are a lot of choices you can make in terms of technology, in terms of process, in terms of what you look at and why, and still with the same outcome of human subject protection and study data reliability. It's just choices of with what level of technology, and as we know, technology is going to evolve. Maybe one day we will be putting ourselves into a machine and all data will roll out. We're not there yet, so we will still work towards better, accurate data with a global environment that we're all in.
So thinking about procedure and how we move forward within these new guidelines, what processes should be put into place to address gaps that we find in risk and quality management as we move forward?
So I think assessing, of course, our technology, the SOPs we have, the skills we have in our teams, and holding them against what is known now in terms of risk management and the sciences around risk management, making sure that we are working towards what is new there. And in doing that, always go back to the simple question that 4-year-olds always ask: why?
Why?
Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And that really enables us to innovate in the right way. There is one U.S. company, I won't name it, but it started out with horse and carriage. When there was new technology, they quickly embraced the new technology of self-driven or driven cars. And they now still have buses that drive around in the US with hotels, because they always go back to the why. Our purpose is to transport people from A to B. Our purpose is to develop new, innovative investigational products so they can be marketed. So going back to that why all the time will get us to the right type of innovations.
So thinking about the workforce in all of this, obviously this is going to be quite a big change for some people that are working in very practical terms at sites and at sponsors and at CROs. Are there going to be training programs that need to be rolled out for this? Do we need new knowledge and new skills to put some of these guidelines into practice?
I believe so. I think we are all trained in the old version of good clinical practice. We've also developed standards that have brought us where we are today. But with these new principles that are added to what we have today, I think new terms are coming up that we need to really embrace and integrate in terms of what they mean. What is risk? What are the components of risk? How do we assess risks appropriately? What do we mean with tolerance for risk or errors? What do we mean with impact? How do we assess those things? And so how can we help our industry, really, from our CRAs to our inspectors, embrace all these new terms in a similar approach? Root cause analysis, what do we do when we conduct an investigation when something goes wrong? Are we all using the same approaches? Do we need to use the same approaches? What can we learn from each other and from those risk management sciences in root cause analysis, and how do we help people to not make the same mistakes again? Yes. How can we foolproof our ways of working? So it's around those type of skills that are more soft, and then there's all these new technologies which may be patchy at times because you innovate in one area, not yet in another.
Yes, yeah.
And so how do you integrate all these technologies, and how do we as people continue to work effectively with these technologies to take the right kind of decisions and provide the right kind of data? So
so the rate of change seems to be accelerating a little bit. Do you think that's
so.
accurate to say that?
I believe so. And it's both at sites where they are perhaps confronted with a new device to measure a new device for blood pressure measurement. I mean, if you went around a hospital 10, 15 years ago, most people would have the handheld little pumps.
Yes.
Today, there's many hospitals that have electronic devices, and these evolve as well, and people need to know how to operate those new technologies. And so it's everywhere that people need to understand how things are done, why they're done, and what matters in all those aspects for the conduct of a clinical trial.
And I guess it's also the onus is on the sponsor and the CRO to educate their staff in the broader picture of why everything's being changed. So
exactly.
Maybe kind of roll out training on or some kind of new skills or knowledge base on why these guidelines are taking place and why these new skills are required.
Indeed, indeed.
So obviously the ICH GCP guidelines apply to the US, EU and Japan. But we live in a world of global clinical trials where a huge phase 3 trial can take place in Africa or Brazil or Asia Pacific somewhere. So does that mean that these guidelines aren't applicable in those studies that are going to be taking place in those countries or all those regions that aren't within the ICH? How is that all going to kind of piece together as a global view?
Yes, it's a great question. So I think in principle, if any country wants to create data that is submitted to either the EU, the US or Japan for marketing purposes or approval for a product to be marketed, they need to abide by the ICH GCP principles. So it's a choice in a way of the sponsor whether they want to go into countries where they might have different rules to still apply ICH GCP or not.
Okay.
And certain countries in the world have chosen to have more stringent rules or variations, but overall, once you have to, or once you want to put a product to the market in Europe, US or Japan, you need to abide by the ICH GCP rules.
So do you think this will perhaps, if a sponsor was designing a trial or a CRO was designing a trial, and normally they would have put, I don't know, a trial site in an African country, Nigeria, for example, that perhaps, I'm just using that as an example, that perhaps that country doesn't abide by the ICH rules. Do you think we might see a lessening of trial sites in certain countries? Do you think that might have a negative effect on clinical research in certain countries?
It would indeed, if there were practices in those countries that were in conflict with what ICH GCP is trying to achieve. So then indeed sponsors would choose not to go to those countries.
Yes.
where countries have more stringent rules than ICH GCP, there would be no issue, of course. But I think for example, the topic of ethical conduct can be a bit different, and the perspectives on ethics can be different from country to country. So a very careful evaluation needs to be undertaken to see whether our principles that we abide by, for example, in US or Europe or Japan around ethical conduct, still match what is relevant in other countries. So those are particular rules that we need to be very careful about.
Okay. I wanted to conclude our conversation today by just by touching on the issue of cost and on deadlines. Essentially, things always come down to budgets and timelines. So do you think that there's going to be a cost to BioPharma, the whole industry really, to implement these new guidelines? And also, do you think that the efficiencies that come with the new guidelines will really outweigh the initial outlay of budget to get it rolling, really?
So I'm a firm believer that yes, in the end, there is going to be a heightened efficiency in how we conduct clinical trials and how we deploy people, technology and processes together in order to bring safe investigational products to the market. There is an investment. There is an investment in change management. That's the biggest piece, I think, that we all are confronted with. There is an investment in technology, and just like with other technologies, when you first put out something, it's quite expensive, and then over time it becomes much more cost efficient. We'll see that here as well. So over time, as we get used to these new ways of thinking, going back to the why when we innovate and think about how we can eliminate redundant tasks and focus on critical tasks and processes that really matter to patients, I think we will get to a space where things are done faster and with more cost efficiency. How fast we get there is probably in our traditional industry a little bit more of a challenge than, for example, the high-tech industry where you need a new smartphone come out every year. So there are steps in this process that take some time. The complexity is evolving as well, and that is a factor that may stop us a little bit from speedy deployment of cost-efficient methods.
So how soon after the guidelines are released will organisations be expected to have all studies aligned to all of these guidelines?
Unfortunately, it's not yet so clear. However, I have heard an inspector say that as soon as these guidance comes out, they will be using the new ICH GCP for inspections.
Oh, really?
And yes, so I think that's an intent that the inspectors have. I think we've seen guidance, for example, around risk-based monitoring that was finalized in 2013. And so I can understand that eagerness to make sure that we are aligned with this new guidance. However, we also have to recognize that not everybody moved to the right speed maybe in adopting all these changes, and maybe right isn't defined either. So I think we will be allowed some time in order to adopt those new methods as well.
But not too much time.
Yes, probably you're right.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Clara, for talking to me today. I've certainly learned a lot about the guidelines and expectations and how it's going to affect the industry, and I'm sure our listeners have certainly learned a lot as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jo. It's been really fun.